The room went silent. What started as a routine Senate hearing suddenly turned into a moment no one in the chamber expected. A senator leaned forward, his voice sharp, challenging former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi in front of cameras, reporters, and a packed room of observers. For a brief moment, it looked like Bondi had been cornered, but then she responded. And within seconds, the atmosphere in the room completely changed. Some people exchanged stunned looks. Others leaned forward in their seats. Even a few reporters stopped typing. Because the response that followed wasn't just an answer. It was a moment that instantly captured everyone's attention, and by the time the exchange ended, people in that room knew they had just witnessed something that would quickly spread far beyond the hearing itself. Here's exactly what happened. The hearing had started like many others in Washington. Rows of cameras lined the back wall of the Senate chamber, their red recording lights glowing quietly as producers and technicians watched the room closely. Staff members moved between seats with folders tucked under their arms, whispering brief reminders to the senators they worked for. Reporters sat along the side rows, flipping open notebooks and checking their phones, ready to capture anything that might turn into the headline of the day. The chamber itself carried that familiar atmosphere that surrounds high-profile hearings in the nation's capital, a mixture of formality, anticipation, and just a hint of tension. Everyone in the room understood that, while many hearings follow predictable scripts, occasionally one question, one answer, or one unexpected exchange can turn a routine session into something people talk about long after the cameras are turned off. At the center of it all sat Pam Bondi. She was seated at the witness table, facing the row of senators, a microphone positioned directly in front of her. A small stack of documents rested neatly beside her, and a glass of water sat untouched near the edge of the desk. Bondi appeared calm and composed. For someone who had spent years in the public spotlight, settings like this were familiar territory. Before arriving at that hearing, she had already built a long career in law and politics. As the former Attorney General of Florida, she had dealt with major legal battles, national media coverage, and intense political debates. Press conferences, courtroom arguments, and congressional hearings had all been part of the job, so sitting before a group of lawmakers, asking difficult questions was nothing new still. Even for experienced officials, a Senate hearing always carries a certain weight. Every statement is recorded. Every answer can be replayed. And every moment has the potential to become the clip that spreads across television and social media within minutes. As the session began, the process followed a familiar rhythm. The committee chair gave a brief opening statement, outlining the purpose of the hearing. He thanked those in attendance and reminded everyone of the rules and time limits for questioning. Then the senators began their rounds, one by one. They leaned toward their microphones and asked their questions. Some focused on policy. Others asked about past legal decisions or broader legal principles. Each senator had only a limited amount of time, so their questions were often direct and carefully prepared. Bondi responded in a measured tone. She spoke clearly, choosing her words with the kind of precision that often comes from years of legal experience. When senators asked about specific cases or legal issues, she explained the reasoning behind decisions, often referring to established law and past rulings. At times, she paused briefly before answering, as if carefully considering how best to frame her response. It was a strategy many experienced witnesses use during congressional hearings. Stay calm. Stay focused. Answer the question without escalating the moment. For the first portion of the hearing, the atmosphere remained controlled and professional. There were no raised voices, no dramatic interruptions, just the steady back rhythm that defines most congressional testimony. Senators asked. Bondi answered. The audience listened. Occasionally, a reporter would type quickly on a laptop, summarizing an answer that might later appear in a news article. Staff members sitting behind the senators occasionally leaned forward to whisper brief suggestions or pass small handwritten notes. From the outside, it looked exactly like what many viewers would expect from a formal government hearing. But inside the room, subtle changes were beginning to appear as the questioning continued. Several observers noticed something interesting. One particular senator had been unusually quiet. He hadn't spoken yet, but he appeared to be reviewing a thick folder of documents placed in front of him. Every so often, he would flip a page, underline a sentence with a pen, or jot down a quick note in the margin. Staff members sitting behind him leaned in to speak quietly, occasionally pointing to sections of the documents as if highlighting something important. It didn't go completely unnoticed. A few reporters began glancing in his direction. They had covered enough hearings to recognize the signs. Sometimes, the most intense moments of a hearing come not from the earliest questions but from the ones that come later. after senators have listened carefully and prepared their approach. Meanwhile, Bondi continued answering questions from the senators whose turns came before his. She maintained the same steady tone, offering detailed explanations while keeping her posture upright and composed. To anyone watching casually, the hearing still appeared routine, but those paying close attention could sense that something might be building. The quiet senator continued, reviewing his notes. Occasionally he looked up toward the witness table, studying Bondi as she answered other questions. Then he would glance back down at the documents. In front of him, the hearing moved forward. Another senator finished speaking. The chair recognized the next member. More questions were asked. More answers followed, yet the atmosphere in the room slowly began to shift. There was a subtle feeling that the next moment might be different. Finally, the committee chair looked down at the list of speakers and called the senator's name. The room seemed to grow just a little quieter. He adjusted his microphone. Closed the folder in front of him, and leaned forward in his chair. It was now his turn to speak, and the tone of the hearing was about to change. The senator leaned toward the microphone. Instead of easing into his question with polite introductions or broad statements, he went straight to the point. His posture shifted forward, his hands resting on the desk in front of him as he spoke. The tone of his voice was firm, steady, and deliberate. It immediately signaled that this would not be one of the routine exchanges that had filled most of the hearing so far. Several people in the room noticed the change. Up until that moment, the hearing had followed the usual rhythm: questions asked, answers given, and the discussion moving steadily from one topic to the next. But this felt different. The senator's words carried a clear challenge. He began by referencing a series of past decisions connected to Pam Bondi's career, carefully laying out the timeline as he spoke. He mentioned legal strategies, public statements, and actions taken during her time as Florida's Attorney General. Each point seemed carefully prepared. It was obvious he had studied the material closely. He flipped open the folder in front of him and pointed to specific notes as he spoke, occasionally glancing up toward Bondi before returning his eyes to the documents. One by one, he laid out his criticisms. Some of the decisions, he suggested, had raised serious questions among legal observers and members of the public. Others, he argued, had sparked controversy at the time they were made. The senator's voice remained calm, but the meaning behind his words was unmistakable. This wasn't just a question, it was an attempt to put Bondi on the defensive as he continued speaking. The room grew noticeably quieter. Earlier in the hearing, reporters had occasionally whispered to each other or quietly typed updates into their laptops. Now many of them had stopped. Several leaned forward slightly in their chairs, listening closely. The clicking of keyboards slowed. Pens hovered over notebooks. Even the senators seated along the long desk appeared to be paying closer attention now. Some folded their hands and watched carefully, while others glanced down at their notes as if preparing to follow up depending on how the exchange unfolded. Moments like this are rare but important during hearings. Most questions are expected. Most answers are prepared, but sometimes a senator chooses a line of questioning that changes the atmosphere in the room. This seemed to be one of those moments. The senator continued, methodically walking through his points. He referenced statements Bondi had made in past interviews. He mentioned legal actions that had drawn public debate. And he raised questions about how those decisions were perceived by critics at the time. The way he presented the information made it clear that this was not an off-the-cuff question. It had been carefully constructed. Each detail seemed designed to build toward a single conclusion. At one point he paused briefly, glancing around the room before continuing. Then, he leaned slightly closer to the microphone. His final remarks sharpened the challenge even further. He suggested that public officials, especially those who have held powerful legal positions, must be prepared to defend their decisions, not only in courtrooms, but also in the court of public opinion. That line seemed to capture the attention of nearly everyone in the chamber. A few reporters immediately began typing again. Others looked up from their notes, focusing on the exchange unfolding in front of them. Bondi remained seated at the witness table, her posture steady. From the outside, she appeared calm, listening carefully as the senator finished laying out his argument. The senator turned one final page in his folder. Then he closed it. There was a brief pause before he delivered his final question, and it was clear that this was the moment he had been building toward. If those decisions were truly justified, he said, his voice steady but unmistakably direct, how do you explain them to the American public today? The words hung in the air. For a brief moment, the room felt completely still. No one interrupted. No one spoke. Cameras along the back wall quietly adjusted their angles, zooming in on the witness table. The red recording lights glowed steadily as technicians ensured the moment was captured clearly. In the audience section, several observers shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that the exchange had reached a critical point. Questions like that are designed to do more than gather information. They test the witness. They challenge credibility. They force a response that can either strengthen a position or weaken it. For a moment, it appeared that the senator had placed Bondi in a difficult position. The question was not just technical or legal, it was personal, political, and public all at once. And the way she answered could shape how the entire exchange would be remembered. All eyes turned toward the witness table. Some reporters leaned closer to their laptops, others raised their phones, ready to record the response that was about to come. Bondi looked toward the senator, who had asked the question. Then she glanced briefly across the panel of lawmakers seated in front of her. For a second, she remained silent. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but it was long enough for the tension in the room to become unmistakable. Everyone was waiting. The senator had delivered his challenge. Now it was Bondi's turn to respond. Pam Bondi paused briefly before speaking. For a moment, she simply sat there, hands resting calmly on the table in front of her. The silence in the chamber stretched just long enough for the tension to become noticeable. Cameras remained fixed on her, reporters watched closely, and several senators leaned slightly forward in their chairs. Then Bondi reached up and adjusted the microphone. It was a small, deliberate movement, but in that quiet room it seemed to signal that her response was about to begin. She looked directly at the senator who had asked the question. Her expression remained composed, her posture steady. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but unmistakably confident. Instead of reacting defensively or challenging the senator's tone, she began by stepping back from the specific criticisms that had just been laid out. She chose to start with the broader principle behind the decisions being questioned. Legal decisions, she explained, are rarely simple. Her words were measured and precise. She described how people outside the legal system sometimes imagine decisions as clear choices between right and wrong, or between two obvious options. But in reality, she said, the work of attorneys general and other legal officials is far more complex. Every major legal decision involves layers of law, competing interests, and the responsibility to interpret the Constitution in a way that protects both individual rights and the broader public interest. Bondi explained that when officials make those decisions, they often must weigh multiple factors at once: statutory, law, court precedents, evidence available at the time, and the potential consequences for the public. These are not decisions made in isolation, she said. They are decisions made within a legal framework that has developed over decades, sometimes centuries. As she spoke, the room remained completely silent. Reporters typed carefully, capturing each sentence. Some senators listened while scanning their notes. Others looked directly at Bondi, following her explanation closely. Then she shifted to address the senators' criticism more directly. Bondi pointed out that many of the actions being questioned had already gone through extensive legal review at the time they occurred. Courts had examined the cases. Legal authorities had evaluated the decisions. And in several instances, she said, those decisions had been upheld. That point, she suggested, was important to remember, because the legal system is built on layers of review and accountability. When controversial decisions are made, they are often tested through litigation and judicial oversight. And that process exists for a reason, Bondi continued. It ensures that decisions made by public officials can be examined and challenged within the framework of the law. Her tone remained steady. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush through her explanation. Instead, she spoke slowly and methodically, walking through the reasoning behind the choices she had made during her time in office. Etys. It was the kind of response that experienced legal professionals often rely on during high-pressure questioning. Stay calm. Stay factual. Stay focused on the legal framework. As Bondi continued, a few senators along the panel nodded subtly. Others flipped through their documents as if reviewing the cases she was referencing. The senator who had asked the question remained still, listening carefully. But Bondi wasn't finished. After explaining the legal process behind the decisions being questioned, she paused briefly before continuing. And when she spoke again, the tone of the exchange shifted slightly. She addressed a challenge that often arises in discussions about past decisions. Hindsight, she said, has a way of making complicated decisions appear simple. Several people in the room looked up as she said it. Bondi explained that when people look back at legal decisions years later, they often have access to information, analysis, and outcomes that were not available at the time those decisions were originally made. In retrospect, certain choices can seem obvious, but in the moment, she said, leaders must work with the facts and circumstances available to them. They must make decisions under pressure, and they must do so while upholding the law and their responsibilities to the public. When those decisions are made, Bondi continued, they are guided by the law, the evidence available at the time, and the duty entrusted to public officials. That duty, she emphasized, carries significant weight. Officials understand that their decisions may affect thousands or even millions of people, and that responsibility requires careful consideration. It is not something taken lightly, she said. For a moment, the chamber remained completely still. The senator who had asked the question leaned back slightly in his chair. Reporters typed quickly, capturing the final lines of her response. Bondi's voice never rose above a steady, controlled tone, but the way she delivered her explanation seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room. What had started as a sharp challenge now felt more like a broader discussion about how legal decisions are made and evaluated. Bondi finished her statement and rested her hands again on the table in front of her. She didn't add anything further. She simply looked back toward the panel of senators. The microphone remained on, the cameras were still recording. And for a brief moment, no one in the chamber spoke. The response had been given. Now the room was left to absorb it. As Bondi finished speaking, there was a noticeable pause. For a few seconds, the room seemed unusually still, the kind of stillness that doesn't happen often during long hearings filled with constant questioning and debate. The senator who had asked the question slowly leaned back in his chair. Just moments earlier, he had been leaning forward, delivering a carefully structured challenge. Now his posture relaxed slightly as he processed the response he had just heard. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The microphones remained on. The cameras continued recording, but the conversation had paused across the chamber. Observers began exchanging quiet glances with one another. Some of them had been following the hearing closely from the start, while others were simply watching to see whether any major moment might emerge. And for many in the room, it seemed that one just had. Along the side rows, several reporters quickly returned to their laptops. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards as they typed summaries of the exchange. While the details were still fresh in their minds, in Washington, timing matters when it comes to reporting. The sooner a moment is captured and shared, the more likely it is to shape the narrative of the day. Some reporters looked up briefly from their screens, glancing toward the witness table before continuing to type. Others quietly whispered to colleagues sitting beside them, comparing notes about how Bondi had framed her response. On the long panel of senators seated across from her, reactions were more subtle. A few senators nodded slightly while Bondi had been speaking, acknowledging the points she had raised about the complexity of legal decision-making. Others remained neutral, quietly reviewing their notes and preparing the questions they planned to ask next. In congressional hearings, body language often says as much as words. A raised eyebrow, a brief nod, a senator leaning forward or leaning back. Those small signals can reveal how the conversation in the room is evolving. And in this case, several observers noticed that the tone had clearly shifted. Just minutes earlier, the exchange had carried a sense of confrontation. The senator's question had been direct and pointed, carefully designed to challenge Bondi's past decisions and force a public explanation. For a moment, it had appeared that the hearing might turn into a more heated back and forth, but Bondi's response had taken a different direction. Instead of escalating the tension, she had stepped back and framed the issue within the broader context of legal responsibility and decision-making. Legal analysts who later reviewed the exchange would point out something interesting about that moment. The discussion had quietly transformed. What began as a sharp challenge about specific decisions had evolved into a wider conversation about how legal officials operate under pressure, how they weigh complex factors, and how those choices are often judged differently with the benefit of hindsight. In other words, the focus of the room had expanded. It was no longer just about a single decision or a single moment from the past. It had become a reflection on the nature of public service within the legal system. And that shift changed the atmosphere inside the chamber. The tension that had filled the room only minutes earlier seemed to soften, not disappear entirely but change. Instead of anticipation for a confrontation, there was now a sense of reflection. Several senators looked down at their folders, flipping through prepared notes as they waited for their turn to speak. Staff members seated behind them quietly passed along small slips of paper containing additional information or suggested follow-up questions. The hearing, after all, still had a schedule to follow. More senators still had time remaining in their questioning rounds. Eventually, the committee chair glanced down at the list of speakers in front of him. He adjusted his microphone and recognized the next senator for questioning. The hearing moved forward. Another voice filled the room. Another set of questions began. And the structured rhythm of the hearing resumed. Yet, even as the discussion shifted to new topics, many people in the chamber were still thinking about the exchange that had just taken place. Moments like that stand out during long hearings, not because they are loud or dramatic, but because they reveal something deeper about the people involved. The way a challenge is delivered, the way a response is given, the way the room reacts in the seconds afterward. Those are the moments that often stay with observers long after the official proceedings have ended. Reporters continued typing. Cameras continued recording. Senators continued asking questions, but the brief exchange between the senator and Bondi had already left its mark on the hearing. Because moments like that rarely happen in such a controlled setting. Congressional hearings are carefully structured events. Time limits are strict, questions are often prepared in advance. And witnesses usually arrive ready to deliver carefully considered answers. But every once in a while, an exchange unfolds that captures the attention of everyone in the room. Not because of raised voices, not because of dramatic gestures, but because of the clarity and confidence of the response that follows a difficult question. And for those who witnessed that moment firsthand, it was clear that something like that had just occurred. When the hearing eventually concluded, the committee chair glanced down at the clock mounted on the wall behind the chamber and announced that the session had reached its scheduled end. One by one, the senators finished their remaining remarks. A few offered brief closing comments, thanking the witnesses for appearing and acknowledging the time that had been spent answering questions throughout the hearing. Then, with a light tap of the gavel, the chair officially adjourned the session. Just like that, the formal proceedings were over. But anyone familiar with Washington hearings knows that the end of the session rarely means the end of the conversation. In fact, sometimes that's when the real discussion begins. As the senators gathered their papers and staff members began organizing documents, the room slowly came back to life. Chairs shifted, quiet conversations began, and people started making their way toward the exits. Reporters packed up laptops and recording equipment, but many of them were already talking about one particular moment from the hearing, the exchange between the senator and Pam Bondi. Outside the chamber doors, the hallway quickly filled with journalists, camera crews, and political aides. Phones appeared in nearly every hand as reporters reviewed their notes and checked the video clips they had captured. Some of them began discussing how to frame the moment in their coverage. Others were already uploading short clips and summaries for their news outlets and social media accounts. In today's political world, moments from hearings can travel far beyond the walls of the chamber within minutes. And this one was no exception. Within a short time, clips of the exchange began circulating online. Short video segments appeared on news websites and social platforms, showing the senator's pointed question followed by Bondi's measured response. People who had not watched the full hearing suddenly found themselves watching that brief moment. And as often happens with political exchanges, viewers reacted in different ways. Some viewers praised Bondi for remaining calm and composed during a difficult line of questioning. They pointed to the way she avoided raising her voice and instead focused on explaining the legal reasoning behind her decisions. To them, her response showed confidence and experience under pressure. Others focused on the senator's approach. They argued that tough questioning is exactly what public hearings are meant to provide. In their view, senators have a responsibility to challenge witnesses and ask difficult questions, especially when those witnesses have held positions of significant authority. For them, the exchange represented accountability in action. Political commentators also weighed in. Some described the moment as an example of how hearings can reveal the thinking behind important legal decisions. Others pointed out how the exchange demonstrated the balancing act that public officials often face explaining complex legal actions to an audience that includes both lawmakers and the broader public. As the discussion spread online and across news programs, different interpretations of the moment began to emerge. Some headlines focused on the senator's challenge. Others highlighted Bondi's response, but nearly everyone covering the hearing agreed on one thing: that brief exchange had become the most memorable moment of the session. And in Washington, memorable moments matter. Political hearings are often filled with lengthy statements, technical explanations, and detailed policy discussions. While those elements are important, they rarely capture widespread public attention. What people tend to remember are the moments when the conversation becomes personal, direct, and unscripted. A difficult question, a carefully delivered response, a pause in the room, where everyone waits to see what will happen next. Those are the moments that travel far beyond the chamber. Those are the moments that get replayed, analyzed, and debated long after the hearing ends. In this case, the exchange between the senator and Bondi had done exactly that. It had transformed a routine portion of the hearing into something people continued discussing hours later, and for many observers, the moment illustrated something important about public service and political debate. In high-pressure environments like congressional hearings, officials are often confronted with difficult questions about past decisions. Those questions can be uncomfortable, they can be challenging, but they also create opportunities for explanations that might otherwise never happen. And sometimes, the most powerful responses are not the loudest ones, they are the calm, deliberate answers that address a challenge directly, because when someone responds with clarity and confidence, it changes the tone of the entire exchange. By the time the hallways outside the chamber began to empty, and the cameras were packed away, the hearing itself had already become part of the day's political news cycle. But the moment people continued talking about remained the same, a senator asking a sharp question, a witness pausing before responding, and a quiet room listening carefully as the answer unfolded. Sometimes the most memorable moments in politics don't come from long speeches or carefully prepared statements. They happen in those brief, unscripted exchanges where a question demands a response, and on that day, inside a packed Senate chamber filled with cameras, reporters, and observers, Pam Bondi faced that moment directly and she answered it. If you found this story interesting, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful courtroom moments and political hearing breakdowns. Also, share this video with friends who enjoy behind-the-scenes insights into major legal and political events, and don't forget to drop a comment below which moment surprised you the most. Your support helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming. Thanks for watching.